So, thus finishing the exile and creation of the Torah period, and now moving on to the priests have returned. They've established their rule as a theocracy. And remember, theocracy technically means ruled by God. But the problem with direct rule by God is that he doesn't answer his email very efficiently. You know, it's hard to get direct communication. So you have deputies, and it's the deputies who represent God. And in this case, the deputies are called priests. Now, one of our challenges in studying this period is that on one hand, we do have more sources than we have for the earlier decades. We have Greek historians, we have Roman historians. They often will cite Egyptian historians or other Judean historians of that period. There is a sense of history and evolution and process and events that need to be recorded contemporaneously or close to it. And so we have more sources for this period in some ways. But also historically, it's not gotten a lot of attention. And it's not gotten a lot of attention in part because of that belief that prophecy had ended, and in part because from the Jewish perspective, everything after the destruction and the finishing of the Torah and the Tanakh is on some level intermission. We can discuss how to enact the laws and what to do, but in the end, real historical events have stopped because we don't have an independent kingdom, so we're not fighting wars. We don't have a king from the line of David, aka Messiah. And so right now we're waiting. You know, remember that line from Fiddler on the Roof at the end when the man asks the rabbi, we've been waiting for the Messiah all our lives. And the rabbi says, well, we'll wait for him somewhere else. It's all intermission. We're waiting from the end of the line of David to the return of the line of David. And where we're waiting and how many of us are waiting and how we're earning a living while we're waiting is not really that important. And Christians also had very limited interest in this Second Temple period because for them, the story skips. It ends with the rebuilding of the temple, and the next major historical event of importance is
birth of Jesus.
The birth of Jesus, right? Year 0, maybe year 6 BCE. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the Roman period, but basically 500 years later. And what happened in between doesn't matter because it only takes on importance once Jesus responds to it. So there's sort of almost a conspiracy here, a collusion between Jewish and Christian scholars to say that the Second Temple period from 500 to about 100 BCE is less important. So we're trying to uncover what's been going on in that period using the sources we have, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon to spend extra time studying the Second Temple period. Now, I'm sorry, was a question? No, okay. So the Zadokites claim descent from a man named Zadok, who is the grandson of Aaron. They later take on the name Sadducee. We'll talk more about them in our next class. But the priests have a few priorities for the kind of system they want to run. First of all, they want organization and stability. That's why the Genesis creation story in chapter 1 goes from chaos, tohu vavohu, the uncertain, unformed mass of the universe, from that to order, light and dark and day and night and land and water and animals and people, and everything is in place and everything is good and very good, and then you have Shabbat at the end. So you have a clear structure based around the number 7, but based on the concept of from chaos to order. So the priests are interested in order and stability because they're in charge, they're on top. You know, they don't want revolution, they don't want prophets going around overturning everything. A second principle of priestly organization is the belief that divine power is tremendously powerful and therefore tremendously dangerous. Think about it like high voltage electricity, okay? If you know what you're doing with high voltage electricity, you can do wonderful things. You could do magnetic levitation trains, you can charge electric cars, you can light up great big buildings. But if you don't know what you're doing with high voltage electricity, you are going to get zapped. You know, occasionally you get a squirrel that wanders into a transformer station and bzz, it's gone. So if divine power is like high voltage electricity, you need a professional who knows what they're doing to operate it. And the professionals who have the training, who have the pedigree, who know the laws of purity, to get there safely and to leave safely, those are the professional clergy or the priests. So that's how the priests get a monopoly on relating to the divine, by telling you how dangerous it is to contact the divine directly. So you get passages in the Torah that say, no one can look on my face and live. No one can see God. You have people who offer strange fire to God. Two of Aaron's sons actually offer it the wrong way, and God wipes them out. You have one man, when they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, it begins to slip and fall, and he runs up to steady it, and he dies because he dared to touch the Holy Ark. You see, these stories emphasize the danger of divine power and therefore reinforce the importance of the priests as the gatekeeper and as the professional who knows how to manage and direct the divine power in the right way. Now, priests are especially experts in this concept of purity and impurity. So I need to explain that briefly because it's not clean and unclean. If you're pure, you're in a state where you can offer a sacrifice. You have no sin attached to you, but you also have no impurity attached to you, which would make you unable to offer a sacrifice safely. It'd be like having, dirt on the lens when you're doing a laser test or something. It just is not going to work. But you don't get pure or impure because of dirt. It has nothing to do with soap or disinfection. And it has nothing to do with evil or good either, because, well, in some cases, evil does create impurity. Sometimes a good deed creates impurity. You're required to care for a dead body. But touching a dead body makes you impure, and you have to go through a purification ritual, whether it's sitting outside the camp for a day, or going to a ritual bath, or having a red heifer get burned and using its ashes to purify you in some way. In fact, we'll see examples of purification that involve throwing blood on people. So it's not clean, but it's pure. So the best way to think of it, I've come up with, is think of it as spiritual schmutz. It's not physical schmutz, dirt. It's spiritual schmutz. And when you have spiritual schmutz on you, you have to get spiritually cleaned, and then you can offer that sacrifice. Now, how do you get spiritual schmutz? One of the theories of where this concept comes from is the idea of crossing the boundary between the ordinary and the sacred. So if I go and offer a sacrifice, I've touched the divine in some way, I've crossed that boundary between the ordinary material and the supernatural spiritual, and therefore I become unclean. In fact, after the sacrifices, the priest is unclean and he has to purify himself. If I've touched the dead body, that body has crossed over to the other plane, and so my impurity comes from touching the supernatural. There's even a debate in a later generation where the rabbis are arguing which books belong in the Hebrew Bible. And the phrasing they use is, if I touch this book, does my hand become unclean? And the irony is, the books that are holy, the books that do belong in the Bible, are the ones that make your hands unclean, because they're supernatural, they're spiritual. You've touched them and crossed the boundary. If you touch the book and it does not make your hand unclean, then it's an ordinary book by a person on your plane, and therefore doesn't belong in the Hebrew Bible. So when we think of pure and impure, we have to think of it in terms of the spiritual schmutz and not in terms of physical material cleanliness. Okay? And this whole concept of purity, impurity, clean, and unclean is also reflected in some of the priestly narratives too. So I'll show you one example of this. This appears in the story of Noah. You'll remember Noah is supposed to take 2 of every animal onto the ark with him, right? Male and female, along with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. That's in chapter 6 with Elohim. If you go into chapter 7, at the top it says, Yahweh said to Noah, come with all your household into the ship. I've seen your righteousness before me in this generation. You will take 7 pairs of every clean animal with you, the male and his female. Of the animals that are not clean, take 2, the male and his female. Birds of the sky, 7 and 7. Now, why do you need extra copies of the male and the female when they are clean? Well, the answer is, what do you do with clean animals? You can A, eat them. You can B, sacrifice them. And that's why you need extras. Because if you only brought one cow and one bull and you decide you want a steak after you get off the ark, oh well, no more cattle. That's the end. So you can see that priestly focus on purity, impurity, clean animals, unclean animals. That's that model where you need a priest to tell you, is this animal sacrificed in the right way? Was the blood taken out properly? Is it blemished in a way that I can't offer it at the temple? Who's going to actually kill the animal at the temple? It's not me, the individual. I might be impure, but the priest who knows exactly how to purify himself, and it was only males, he can actually do the killing of the animal in the proper way so that he is purified onto the spiritual plane to be able to contact the God safely, and then can purify himself afterwards to return to ordinary life. Okay, so you sort of get the idea of this pure, impure concept. Susie, you have a question?
Yeah, this whole idea, I'm going to lose track of it because it's kind of abstract, but this whole idea that having the everyday, the ordinary, have contact with the sacred or the spiritual, to include a dead body, is profaning, is impurifying. In the Atlas book, that's one of the alternate texts for this course, there's an essay early on where the author, who by the way is very confused in some ways, I think we could talk about that as we go through.
Well, remember, there's several, each section is a different author. It's not one author.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that. Thank you. I'm glad I raised it. But there's very early on, there's an essay about kosher and about making distinctions and how the distinctions are very, very important. And it goes so far as to say that one reason the Jews could not accept the deity of Jesus is that it's a mixture. So it aligns very much with what you're saying, I think.
Oh,
Yeah.
I read that section. That was a really cool thing too, where it's the mixture of unlike things, mixture of fabrics, mixture of cross. That was a really good section.
Fabrics and foods, the whole thing. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah.
I think you pointed out that there's different voices in this book.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit hard to read all the way through, but each one,
Yeah.
if you take it as a standalone piece, is a
Yeah.
little bit easier.
Yeah,
So-
thank you.
So that's part of the priestly sort of orientation here. And remember, their number one recommendation of how you do Jewish is offer sacrifices at the temple. You can recite words and you can sing things. Again, literacy is not widespread, so there isn't a lot of Torah reading and studying going on. The number one thing that people can is offer their sacrifices. And there are sacrifices for Thanksgiving, not our capital T Thanksgiving, just being grateful. There are sacrifices for sins that you have to atone for. There are sacrifices for hopes for the future, where you're looking for something positive going forward. There are holiday sacrifices. There are festival sacrifices for the pilgrimage festivals. There are daily sacrifices that are offered on behalf of everybody. Sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice is the major practice of doing Jewish. And of course, that keeps the priests well employed. And their claim is there's only one place to do it. Now, the irony is, we know of a second Judean temple after the exile, because there was a garrison of Jewish mercenaries. You wouldn't think of Jews being mercenaries, but they were in a tough neighborhood. They were actually sought after sometimes as soldiers. There was a garrison of Jewish mercenaries posted at Elephantine, which is up the Nile, away from the Nile Delta, further south, that actually built their own temple to Yahweh, where they were, because they were stuck in this garrison in Egypt. They couldn't get to Jerusalem. And they actually wrote to the temple in Jerusalem trying to get support for what they were doing at their temple in Elephantine. So even this idea of only one place to worship and only one temple allowed was not as universally accepted. Now, from the reports from Elephantine, the priests in Jerusalem were not so thrilled about this competing temple being set up in Egypt. They were not a fan of this, and often sometimes tried to work to undermine it. But the reality is that it's a more complex story than we're sometimes led to believe by the sources. In the end, by having only one site where you were allowed to sacrifice, it created a monopoly, and that produces affluence. It makes it a center of pilgrimage, but it also creates a danger there because you begin to collect over time a lot of resources and money and donations. And if there's only one place it's collecting, that becomes an attractive target for outside people or for rivalries. Because what happens if a high priest has two sons? Is the younger son just going to say, okay, fine, I'll be an assistant my whole life, even if his older brother is an idiot? You understand, having hierarchies creates rivalries and creates factions and clans. And so the rivalries within the temple will explode into this diverse Jewish sectarianism of the Second Temple period because of arguments over how they're doing it in the temple and who becomes the high priest and who isn't the high priest and who has patronage sponsorship from outside empires to become the high priest and who's illegitimate and who's setting the calendar and who's deciding what the right sacrifices are and so on and so on. So it's sort of this, a yo-yo effect where you try to centralize the establishment and the rules, and it creates more diversity by people rebelling against the rigidity you're trying to impose. So let's try to picture the cosmology of this world. And I want to give you an image for this. So I'll have to paint a picture for you. If I had a board, I'd draw it instead. So you have to think of this as like concentric circles or courtyards that are coming together. A centrality of geography. What is the holiest country of all the countries in all the world? It is the land of Judea. What is the holiest city of all the cities in Judea? It is Jerusalem. What is the holiest mountain of all the mountains in Jerusalem? It is the Temple Mount where the temple stands. And what is the holiest place of all the places in the temple complex? It's actually called the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, okay? Now, what's the holiest people of all the peoples in the world? The Jews. What's the holiest tribe of the holiest people? It's the Levites, the tribe of Moses. What's the holiest clan of the holiest tribe of the holiest people? It's the Cohens, the priest. If you know anybody whose last name is Cohen or Khan or Kahana or Katz, which stands for Cohen Tzedek or high priest, they claim descent from that clan. And who is the holiest member of the holiest clan of the holiest tribe of the holiest people? It is the high priest. Okay? Now, what is the holiest language of all the world's languages? Obviously, Hebrew. What is the holiest word in the holiest language? It's the name of the God that you're not supposed to say. And in the calendar, what is the holiest moment? It is the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so what happens on the Day of Atonement is the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, the one time a year he does it, and he says the name of God. And so you have this conjunction of the holiest person in the holiest place at the holiest moment, using the holiest word in front of the holiest people. And so it's that centralization that defines the high priests on top, but also defines their vision of the world. So if you could see the image I was trying to share before of the temple, you'd see that there are these concentric courts that branch out, and you have the part that only the priests or only the Cohens are allowed to go into, and the part that only the Levites are allowed to go into, and then the part that only Israelite men are allowed to go into, and then there's the court that only the Israelite women are allowed to go into, and then there's the court of the Gentiles that any non-Jew who wants to offer a sacrifice can come to, and anybody who can go higher can go through the other levels, but there's somebody to stop you. So if you're non-Jewish, you're stopped at that first gate. If you're a Levite, you can go all the way through. So if a non-Jew wanted to sacrifice, he would meet a Levite at the end of his court, give the Levite the animal, and they would bring it up to offer it. And then an Israelite woman could get closer, Israelite man could get even closer, the Levites were even closer than that, and the Cohens are the ones who could actually go all the way into the center. And again, only the high priest could go all the way to the Holy of Holies. So I do want to share with you an example of a text related to this. This is from Leviticus chapter 16, and it'll give you a flavor of the purification rituals, which again are not about being clean. This is starting in verse 3. Aaron shall come into the sanctuary with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen tunic. He shall have the linen trousers on his body and put on the linen sash and be clothed with the linen turban. They are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and put them on. Again, the garments are holy, so he has to purify before he even puts them on. He takes from the congregation 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. He offers the bull of the sin offering and make atonement for his house. He can't even offer sacrifices till he's atoned for his house, and then he's pure enough to offer the sacrifices. He takes the 2 goats and sets them before Yahweh. He casts lots for the 2 goats, 1 for Yahweh, 1 for the scapegoat. And the goat on which the lot fell goes to Yahweh and goes to a sin offering. And the goat that on the lot fell for the scapegoat is presented alive to make atonement and then is sent away into the wilderness. Aaron presents the bull of the sin offering. He takes a censer full of coals off the altar and 2 handfuls of incense. He puts the incense on the fire before Yahweh, so the cloud of the incense covers the mercy seat on the covenant, so he does not die. So walking into the Holy of Holies, he has to be covered in a cloud of incense smoke so that he doesn't see God by accident. And so God is the man behind the curtain, so to speak, to use a Wizard of Oz reference. He takes some blood of the bull and sprinkles it with his finger on the mercy seat on the east. And before the mercy seat, he sprinkles some of the blood with his finger 7 times. And then he kills the goat of the sin offering for the people, brings his blood within the veil, and does with the blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkles it on the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. He makes atonement in the holy place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel and their transgressions and their sins. No one shall be in the tent of meeting when he enters to make atonement until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and his household and all the assembly of Israel. There's even an anecdote that they used to tie a rope to his foot. In case he committed a sin and was struck dead, they could drag him out, but they couldn't go in themselves to get him. He shall go out to the altar and make atonement there, sprinkle the bull's blood there, and again using the blood on his finger. Then he presents the live goat. He puts his hands on the head of the live goat and confesses over him all the sins of Israel. And so they are put on the head of the goat, and the goat is sent away to Azazel, to the wilderness, or maybe even to a demon god. And he carries all the sins out of the tent. Aaron comes into the tent of meeting, takes off the linen garments he put on, and then has to bathe himself in water, put on his clothes, and offer his burnt offering, the offering of the people, and make atonement for himself. The person who let the goat go as the scapegoat shall wash his clothes, bathe his flesh in water, and then come back into the camp. So even the person carrying the goat away needs to purify himself afterwards. And then notice at the end of this passage, it is a statute forever. On the 7th month, the 10th day of the month, it is a statute forever. Verse 32, the priest who is anointed and consecrated to be priest in his father's place shall make the atonement, put on the linen garments, even the holy garments, and make atonement for the sanctuary, for the tent of meeting, and for the altar, and for the priests, and for all the people. So you get a flavor there of how the priests are trying to establish their authority with magic power and magic deeds, but also with theater, with production values, with excitement. And there's a passage in rabbinic teaching that said there was no happier day for the Hebrews than the 15th of Av, which was a day of sort of fertility festivals, and the Day of Atonement. You think the Day of Atonement is the happiest day? But if your sins are forgiven, then it becomes a happy day at the end of the day. Once the goat is sent out with all your sins, I feel a relief, right? It's like a load has been lifted. So this is a flavor of the priestly style of Judaism. The ritualism, the focus on purity and impurity, blood sacrifices, and everything else. But the seeds that are planted in this period is the whole concept of a diaspora and pilgrimage and coming to the land of Israel to offer these sacrifices, even if only once a year. In fact, the word for pilgrimage festival in Hebrew is chag, which now is the generic term for festival, but it's directly related to the Arabic term hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. So the 3 chagim, the 3 festivals you were supposed to go to Jerusalem, were the 3 pilgrimage trips to Jerusalem. And this is also why, by the way, by the time of Jesus, you had money changers in the temple. because people are coming from all over the place and they need to change their money to be able to buy the sacrifices to offer them as pilgrims in the temple. And one of the ironies is if you walk in the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, I think one of the first signs you've seen is tourist information. And one of the next signs you've seen is money changing. And I love the fact that you still see money changing in Jerusalem when you're on your way into the Temple Mount. And as I said, we also have the seeds of centralization and its discontents, which will become the future of Jewish diverse sects and rivalries in the following period when the Greek influence becomes stronger. And we call that the Greeks and Maccabees period, which we'll be talking about next time.
Adam, you had one of the last parts of the text you were reading was talking about the son of the high priest.
Mm-hmm.
Was it like a royal lineage? And if so, what if the high priest didn't have a male child?
Well, I mean, as is the case in other royal houses, I'm watching The Crown right now, so this is like really, present in my mind. But as was the case in other royal houses, you would go to the brother of the high priest and then his kids, and so there were ways to do it. But the priests had certain purity rules that defined them differently. So, as one example, at least in rabbinic law, someone who is a Cohen, a priest, is not allowed to marry a woman who's had sex before, because you want to guarantee the pedigree line from male priest to male son of a priest. So a divorced woman is not allowed to marry a priest. Even a raped woman is not allowed to marry a priest. And there have been terrible cases in Israel, which does follow Jewish law, on marriages where someone was engaged to a woman, she got raped, and then he was not allowed to marry her because he was a Cohen. And, this is awful. But when you're stuck following the ritual laws as prescribed in the text, there are certain things you just can't get around. And that was one of them. So they could get they could leave the country and do a civil marriage, but they couldn't get a recognized by the rabbinate marriage. And if they were Orthodox themselves, they would want that kind of a marriage. And so they're stuck in this very difficult position. A priest is also not supposed to be near a dead body, because you have to maintain yourself in as pure a position as possible in case the temple is built in the next 30 seconds and you need to get going to work. You don't have time for a day outside of the camp. So I have heard stories of rabbis who are Cohens who, when they are giving eulogies, actually have to do it in a different room. They can't do it in the same room as the body for the funeral service. They have to pipe in the sound because they can't be exposed to a dead body. If it's their parent, they could do it for themselves, right? That's a positive commandment, to honor your parents, that supersedes the don't be impure. If you ever look at a list, by the way, of the supposed 613 commandments that are to be found in the Torah, Maimonides has a list, some other rabbis have made lists. A large proportion of those commandments have to do with priest rules of ritual impurity and purification. They don't apply to the vast majority of Israelites. So people sometimes claim that this 613 means we're, such an ethical people because we have all these ethical rules, but a large chunk of them are purity rules that apply only to priests. They don't apply to the ordinary hoi polloi who are out there. And, that's the problem when you actually read the story and read the details. It doesn't always live up to the hype.
I'd also add that having lots of rules is not the same thing as morality and ethics.
Yes. Well, that's the difference between mitzvah as commandment and our use of mitzvah as a good deed. If we think of mitzvahs as good deeds, then it's all, honor the elderly and care for the poor, and okay, fine. But if you actually read the mitzvot, the commandments, and some of them are those ethical things and some of them are these ritual things, then you get a more complex picture.